Hello again, I'm Zoltán Lehoczky from Lombiq Technologies. Now that we have our local development environment for our .NET site ready, and we have also written some code, let's take a look at how we can use recipes to synchronize content and configuration possibly between our production site on .NET and our local development environment. So let's see an example. Here's our production website on .NET itself, and this we started as a blog, so let's pretend that we are actually blogging away. So let's create a new blog post which I will call demo blog post with a lot of imagination, and yeah, there will be some text, etc. It will be of course a travel category, we don't really have anything else. And now on our production website we have two blog posts. That's awesome, but when we run the application locally, well, we still just have the single default blog post. Now with blog posts that's probably not a huge issue, but if you want to add some more involved custom pages, or if you actually want to customize blog posts in a bit more detail as well, then probably you want to have the same content in your local development environment as well that you have on .NET. And of course, Orchard's facility for that, or feature for that, is recipes. We'll actually use recipes and deployments for deploying our theme as well in the next step. But first, let's take a look at recipes. Now, you can start with your .NET site by starting locally, actually. In this example, we started by setting up our site on .NET and using the built-in blog recipe. So the next step would be to synchronize content, to export content from our production site and import it locally. But if you were to start with a local site from scratch, then you might want to set up your .NET site with a blank recipe, for example, and import everything that you prepared locally. Either way can work. Starting on .NET is perhaps a little bit easier. So that means that we have to export from our production site now. What we'll use for that will be the deployment feature of Orchard. So we'll create a deployment plan. You can just export, for example, blog posts. We won't go into the details of recipes, but it can get really involved. Instead of exporting specific blog posts, what I will do here is that I will show you kind of the full-blown solution, what means that we'll export pretty much everything. The point being that when we export our production site, we can import locally and have everything as we have on .NET. I just added a single blog post now, but if I were to add multiple blog posts, or if I were to add a new blog, new pages, turn on features, set up search, everything like that, our export should still include everything related to that, and we should also see every such change locally too. So I will add a very big deployment plan here, and since it will contain everything, let's actually call it full export. And if you already know the deployment feature and recipes, there won't be much news for you here. But here is what we recommend doing. We'll need to add steps in order. First of all, let's add the all features step. So we have a configuration of every feature available and turned on .NET, also turned on locally. We can ignore the disabled features. We won't really use that. Then we also need to add content definitions. The replace content definitions tab is suitable for that. Since this will be a full export, well, we actually want to include all of the content types and part definitions. This way, we'll get all the features enabled that we have on DotNest, and we'll get all the content types and content parts too. Next, let's export some actual content. We have multiple steps available, and we have to use multiple steps for that. Actually, admin menus would be the first thing. While we are at it, let's also export admin settings. We also need content items. We have content types now, but we also need all content items. Yes, this is important. How we'll use this recipe is that we'll execute it without a setup as part of the setup. So export as a setup recipe is actually necessary for us. Do note that with this in place, if you have, as it's also indicated here, if you have references between content items, you will actually need to update those references. Now that I think about it, actually, let's first try without this, because we have a blog, and the blog posts are related to the blog, and that's a relationship that we need to retain. So let's actually not do that. Otherwise, we need everything else. So let me just quickly go through that. Media profiles, also queries. The next would be roles. Now, your mileage may vary, so perhaps you don't need everything, but if you want to be sure, just indeed export everything. Let's also export shortcode templates, and all templates we won't need. We are using media themes, and we write our templates as liquid files. We won't use the templates feature. If you actually do use the templates feature, then you also need to export those. But I highly recommend not mixing these two. Either use templates from the admin or use media theme, but not both. That will just make things a little bit more complex. We can also export, audit trail settings, update content definitions we don't need, since we use the replace content definitions. We don't need the content step either, since we used all content. Custom file is not really applicable here. Custom settings, we don't have custom settings, but in the future we may have, so let's include that as well. Delete content definitions we won't need. Deployments plans we will need. And this is also useful if you want to export in reverse. So you change something locally, you want to export it, and you want to import it on your .NET production side. This will allow you to do that. Let's continue with the next step. JSON recipe is not applicable. Login settings, sure, why not? The next is media. Let's also export that, but do note that it will include, unfortunately, sorry, let's track back. How media theme deploys, or how media theme is stored, is in the media library. Well, hence the name. Now, if you include all media here, then those files will be included in the export too. That's actually not what you want. Instead, it would be better just to export those files that you actually uploaded manually as media files. So far so good, but you either select specific files and folders here, or you select all media. Now we don't have our media theme deployed yet, so there's no folder for it. It will be _media theme, by the way, so we can't exclude it. Now, if you store pretty much all of your media files in subfolders, then just ticking them like this and not ticking the media theme folder would be what you should do. Otherwise, if you are also putting files and new folders into the root of the media library, then I recommend using include all media, because if you don't do that, then you will have to come back here and tick all the new files and folders again. So let's go with the safe option, include all media. The next step would be, to export placements as well, something that you might want to customize as well. We can also export content items based on a query, but we won't utilize it. We export everything. Recipe files is not really applicable. Replace content definitions we already have. Site settings is actually useful. And let's export everything. Yeah, let's tick these two. Okay, and finally, let's also export themes. We will actually override the theme settings, but having the default available too is useful. So now we have the deployment plan put together. The only thing remaining is to, well, execute it and download the corresponding zip file. All right. The exports will take a minute, and what we'll do once it opens is that we'll include everything in our theme project. You see that in our theme project there's actually a recipes folder coming from the sample theme. So we can utilize this recipes folder too, and probably also the existing sample setup recipe. We won't need the media theme folder, as I mentioned, and I have now the recipe here. Let me actually put it into a new file. It's a good practice to have two recipe files at least here. One will be your setup recipe, so the recipe that the auto setup feature also executes. And that will configure everything that you just need in your local development environment. And it will also execute another recipe, and that another recipe will contain everything that we just exported. This is good in two ways. First of all, from the setup recipe, you can easily override settings like, well, theme settings. Or perhaps you want some features locally not enabled that you will otherwise have on your production site. Also, it's useful because when you want to continuously update your local development environment with the content of your production site, you will be able to just quickly do an export and pretty much overrides that recipe file. So let me actually follow up with this concept. Here is what we'll do. Let's take a look at this setup recipe. There's a lot of stuff that we won't need here, but you can either start with a blank recipe or something like this. Probably it's a little bit easier to start with the sample, because you have something there that you need to change instead of starting from very scratch. First of all, let's rename it so we have a name corresponding to our project. And now that we have changed this name, let's actually also change the setup recipe name configured for auto setup. So formerly we have used the block recipe here. Now let's use our new setup recipe. As you can see, it is a setup recipe. The display name, that can be something nice. I will just use the technical name here. Description, author, you can change as you like. And now for the important things. Here in the sample recipe, we have the following steps. We have a feature step. We will need that to enable our theme locally. When we use media theme, the theme that's enabled on the production site will be the media theme. And it will load the content of our theme that we deployed from the media folder, from the media library. Our theme actually won't exist on the production site as a proper theme. Locally though, we have it. So we'll need to enable that feature. So let me actually do that. I will copy the name of our theme to here, and let me remove all of these feature enable configurations, and let's add our theme. We also have a themes configuration here. That's actually something we need. Again, locally we need to enable our theme, and not just enable the feature, but we also need to set it as the current site theme. So that's what I will do here. We don't really need to change the admin theme, that can be the default. We also have a recipes section here. Now remember that I mentioned that we will execute the recipe for the exported recipe here. Let's actually do that. And for that, let's create a new recipe file. We will fill the file with the exported content in a minute. But let's just create a new file and let's call it oops, I actually forgot to rename our recipe, sorry, our recipe file. So this should also be called like this. It's getting to be a pretty long name. All right, so let's create a new file here for the actual export content. Let's call it export. And we'll add some content here in a second. And let's use this name here when we execute the recipe. So this will be the recipe that's executed from our setup recipe. You can also change the execution ID if you want, but conventionally it's the name of the root web project. All right. So far so good. We don't need the media theme section. That will be handled automatically by the deployment tool that we'll use in the next tutorial. And we don't really need the media section here either, because the media that we export from the production site will be in the export recipe. So let me clear these. We also need to shuffle things around a little bit. the order of recipe steps matter, if we, as we have seen when we have created the deployment plan too. So we will first need to actually execute the export recipe, because in later steps we will override things from there. So first we execute the recipe, and then we need to enable our theme. And lastly, we need to override the current site theme settings, which will be provided by the export, by the way, keep in mind. So that's why we need this step after the recipe. And to enable our theme as the site name, we also need to enable the corresponding feature. So this is why the feature step, it comes before the theme step. All right, so far so good. And now let's actually add our export recipe. Let me copy it from the file that we have downloaded a minute ago. And here it is. It's a huge file, but don't worry, we won't need to dig into it too much. Well, we won't need to dig into it too much once you are exporting again and again, but to be frank, unfortunately, we'll need to dig into it just this one time to change a couple of things that are not really applicable locally. So the SDK actually has some tips on that, some tips on that as well. Let me start from the very beginning. First of all, we'll need a name. The name has to be the same as the export here. By the way, this is something that's also possible to configure under the deployment plan. Display name can be the same. Everything else can be the default if you don't want to bother. Done. Then under features, we don't need anything related to Azure. DotNest runs on Microsoft's cloud, Azure. And if you happen to test your application either in Azure or at least with an Azure blob storage emulator and everything else locally set up, then you can use those features. But probably most of the time that's not really interesting. So let me remove the enable for application insights, Azure data protection and storage. And we don't really have anything else that would be interesting. All right. And that should be sufficient. Let's do a quick check here. Let's check out our demo blog post here. And it should contain a reference to our blog here. So that looks all right. Let me check whether the content item ID is otherwise correct as well. It's correctly configured for the home page. It's also correctly configured in our admin menu. And finally, it's also correctly configured in the for the blog itself. Now let's actually check it out during our application running locally. So I'm again killing the application, shutting down IS Express, and let's remove the app data folder for our web project. If you want to pretty much start anew, as far as content and configuration goes, an Orchid Core application, then you need to go to the web project and remove the app data. Of course, if you have some content or something that you actually want to keep, don't do that. We only do that because we store everything in recipes and we use auto setup to run the whole thing on the first request. So let me start the application again, and let's go back to our browser and let's see what happens. And we get an exception while starting the application. It's, as you can see, important that we indeed include everything from the export package. Our export included media files, or included the media deployment step. To make it work, we can't just include the media deployment step in the recipe, but we also need to add the corresponding files. But that's no issue because they are actually available, well, in the export package. So let me move them to the recipes folder. So we can also change these file references here. Yeah, let me open this in the file system. We can actually change the file references corresponding to these media files in the recipe. So not all of these files are simply there in the recipes folder's root, but yeah, that would be a little bit of hassle because then on every export you will need to change that. I don't think it's really worth it. But of course, if you use subfolders for media files, those subfolders will be reflected here as well. It's just that by default, the blog recipe keeps these files in the root folder. And now that we restart the application, we are greeted by the setup screen, because it's important that when you have an issue with your setup recipe, with auto setup, you will need to not just restart the application, but you need to also, again, clear out the app data folder. So that's what I will do. Again, stopping IS Express, and we need to remove app data because, because now it contains a database that's half set up. We don't want that. So let me restart the application again, and let's see for the setup to finish this time. Just as before, everything is initialized on the first request, and as you can see, this still looks like the blog, but our demo blog post is also here. And if you open it, we see that our theme with this beautiful text color is still applied. So this still works. Now, just to recap and make sure that everything is clear. Until now, we have created our theme project. In the theme project, we added some static resources directly in the web root folder. But again, you can use some client-side build pipelines as well. Just be sure to eventually compile those files in the web root folder. Then we reference those files from a liquid shape template override. Of course, you can override other shape templates as well. And finally, we tweaked our development experience a little bit by adding our custom setup recipe and then exporting the whole content of our website to this export recipe, what our setup recipe executes. So now we have a pretty complete development story. Locally, we see pretty much the same as it is on our production website on DotNest. We can work with it completely locally. We can change the code. We can change the configuration and the content as well locally if you like. And we can continuously keep our local development environment up to date with content and configuration coming from the production website. We will continue with the last step, with deploying our theme to the production site, which will be quite exciting. But for now, thank you for watching.